welcome to the House this afternoon. Minister, the Civil Engagement Group has tabled this motion because for a long time we have been deeply concerned about the way in which Europe has hardened its borders over the past decade, in our capacity as both European citizens and European parliamentarians. As Europeans, this hardening of borders is being carried out in our name. The tragic deaths we have seen in recent weeks in the Mediterranean are directly related to European migration and border policies, for which we all bear some responsibility, whether we wish to acknowledge this or not. As the motion outlines, it is estimated that 27,000 people seeking refuge in Europe have drowned or gone missing in the Mediterranean since 2014. And these figures are widely understood to be a significant underestimate. Last week on World Refugee Day, activists in Berlin read out the names of those 27,000 people. It took 32 hours. These are 27,000 people who came to our continent fleeing war, persecution, the climate crisis and other horrific circumstances that were not met with anything close to resembling the founding values of the European Union. Those are human dignity, equality and human rights. Instead, they were met with hard borders and hard hearts, both constructed to keep asylum seekers outside of Europe. And I want people to keep this in mind when we remember the government's motion to this motion, and really take in the contribution in relation to this, and then ask yourself why we have a counter motion in this regard. Over the past decade, European policy has increasingly been about keeping asylum seekers outside Europe, and the deals done with countries such as Libya and Turkey have resulted in systematic violations of fundamental human rights. I use the word systematic because the system we have designed is enabling this. Prior to 2017, the Irish Naval Service was engaging in search and rescue missions in the central Mediterranean through bilateral treaties. In 2015, our Naval Service rescued 8,592 people from the Mediterranean. In 2017, we were entering the EU Operation Sophia. The then Minister of State for Defence, Paul Keogh, told the Dáil that transferring to Operation Sophia would result in the redeployment of Irish Naval Services vessels from primarily humanitarian search and rescue operations to primarily security and interception operations. The result of this change in policies are clear. By 2018, the number of people the Naval Service was rescuing fell to 1,888, and in 2019, Operation Sophia stopped search and rescue completely. Operation Irene, the successor to Operation Sophia, does not have a search and rescue mandate at all. Instead, what we see is the Libyan Coast Guard being notified when there is a ship attempting to cross, and if they make it to the ship, those people are returned to detention centres in Libya, where they will face horrific conditions, which I will discuss more in a moment. The agreement the EU made with Libya was formalised in 2017 Malta Declaration, which had a number of objectives, including the determination to act in full respect of human rights, international law and European values, and to ensure adequate reception capacities and conditions in Libya for migrants. Both of these objectives have clearly failed. It is also important to recognise that across Europe, civil society groups and NGOs have been criminalised for engaging in search and rescue. They are being criminalised merely for attempting to fill the gap left by EU countries when they abandoned these search and rescue responsibilities. We are all aware of the case of Sean Binder, who was put on trial by the Greek authorities, supposedly for espionage. Mr Binder and other humanitarian workers were disgracefully targeted for their search and rescue work as part of wider criminalisation across Europe. This must stop, and our motion calls on the government not only to work to end this criminalisation, but to support the essential work that these organisations do. When migrants are returned to Libya, they are faced with literal hell on earth. Hundreds of millions of European taxpayers' money is being spent funding centres where torture and violence are commonplace. I commend Irish journalist Sally Hayden for her role in reporting on this, particularly her excellent book, My Fourth Time We Drowned. In Libyan detention centres, people seeking asylum are faced with violence, sexual violence, torture and murder. The conditions also cause disease such as TB, which can spread. Ms Hayden reports on the experience of people in the Tariq al-Sika detention centre during a TB outbreak, where people were left with no assistance. In Tripoli Shara al-Zawiya centre, former detainees reported that guards raped women and some were coerced into sex in exchange for their release or for essentials such as clean water. People who speak up against such abuses are tortured or in some cases disappeared. Imagine what such gross violations of human rights will do to a person, their body and their mind. One story that struck with me is that of a 20-year-old man who was trapped in a detention centre, the conditions so horrific that he set himself on fire. I could recount hundreds of stories of unnecessary human suffering, but instead I will read a quote from one of those who lived through the hell of this detention centre. People want to die in the sea rather than in the detention centres. At this time, human rights are sleeping. Life is very cheap. One quote from the former head of policy and development at the UNHCR is also particularly striking. One day I hope everyone will look back with incredulity on the EU's complicity with human rights abuses in Libya and the UN's failure to speak out on this matter. These abuses aren't solely carried out by militants or human traffickers, but happen in centres run by the EU-backed Libyan government of national unity. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and Medicine Sans Frontières have all condemned the EU's complicity in this. A 2021 report from Amnesty highlighted that despite pledges to close the Directorate for Combating Illegal Migration centres, similar patterns of violations have been reproduced in newly opened or reopened centres. At EU level, instead of ending this shameful complicity and establishing safe routes, we have seen more calls for harder borders. Earlier this year, the European People's Party leader in the European Parliament, Manfred Weber, put out a statement regarding migration policy. In it, he called for the building of fences along the external border and the construction of registration and reception centres outside Europe's borders. Let us be very clear. These are the policies of the far right. Parliamentarians from across political divides were very happy in 2016 to call out Donald Trump and his border wall for what it was. Why are we not doing the same when European politicians are calling for effectively the same on our continent? Well said. I also note that the following shipwreck near Greece this month, that many European politicians decried the role of traffickers in this. Let us be very, very clear. The best way to combat trafficking is to ensure safe routes, so that people can have their asylum claims heard in Europe. If safe routes were provided, traffickers would have no business model, and so it is the duty of Europe to provide those safe routes. This leads us to a fundamental question. Why do we, who are born in the safety of Europe through absolute moral luck and nothing else, work to make this continent a more unwelcoming place? Those founding principles of the European Union, human dignity, equality, human rights, values I believe in, where are they now? What we have instead is a Frankenstein version of European values, a reality where we are both creator and monster. Earlier this year, my colleague Senator Higgins asked a question in response to comments from the Taoiseach that migration policy should be hard, firm and fair. How is it fair that EU countries that have a long history of ransacking African countries for their wealth and resources, which has contributed to the climate change that makes parts of the world uninhabitable, continue to focus their efforts on identifying how they can be more unwelcoming rather than on how they can ensure that the world is a habitable place? In bringing this motion, we want to show that there can be accountability, and we want the Irish Government, the European Commission and the Council to live up to the founding values of our Union. I am arguing all parties to support this motion and reject the Government's counter-motion, because this situation cannot be allowed to go on. There must be accountability and justice for what has happened and what is happening. Tonight, people from parts of the world rife with conflict, violence, climate breakdown and poverty are sitting in detention centres in Libya or in other dire conditions at Europe's external borders. They deserve a safe future as much as we do, and I commend this motion to the House.